to Lecture 10. In this lecture, we will begin to think about how attorneys and the parties they represent influence decision-making on the Supreme Court, delving into the role of oral arguments. In the next lecture, we'll consider the characteristics of the attorneys, but in this one, we'll focus on the justices themselves. While oral arguments provide an opportunity for the justices to directly interact with the attorneys, and there is much to be learned from that process to be sure, attorneys for both parties also file legal briefs at the merits stage, and the justices and their law clerks spend a great deal of time with those briefs, both before and after oral arguments. So today we'll explore how the justices use litigant briefs, especially as they create the court's opinion, and we'll take a really long look at how justices behave during oral arguments as we consider what their behavior reveals about the case. So I think it's helpful to take a step back a moment and situate where we are, in particular really clarifying the difference between the agenda setting stage and the merits stage. So by way of quick review, we just spent a lot of time talking about the agenda setting stage. At the agenda setting stage, the justices have a couple of options, right? They can deny a case, which is what happens to the vast majority of the cases. If the court denies a case, it in effect affirms the lower court's decision. It doesn't mean that the justices agree with the lower court's decision, but it allows that lower court's decision to stand, controlling only in the circuit or the state from which the case came from. So that's what happens in the vast majority of cases. The court can also take some sort of summary action at the agenda setting stage. So that is the grant, vacate, and remand that we talked about, or they can hold the case over, but essentially the court does something really quick, issues a one-sentence opinion to dispose of the case is ruled upon, and it's effectively finished. The more interesting option is when the court ultimately grants a case. And so that's what the previous couple of lectures have dealt with, is what are the exceptional circumstances that allow the justices or make it more likely that the justices choose to grant a case. If a case is granted, then we move from the agenda setting stage into what we think of as the merit stage. So the case has been granted, it lands a coveted spot on the Supreme Court's docket. At that point, the parties submit written briefs in the case. Basically, we'll talk about what is contained in the briefs, but a short summary is that it just contains the main arguments that the parties are going to make at oral argument. So those are submitted before oral argument. Oral argument is scheduled in the case. After oral argument, the justices go back into private conference. They sit together as a unit of 9 justices. They vote on the case. They establish winning and losing, majority and dissenting coalitions. The justices disperse to their chambers. That's where the opinion writing action happens. And then the opinion is finally released, often months later. Obviously, we'll talk much more about the opinion writing process later this semester. But what's pretty notable when we're in this column of the merits decision-making stage is that some of this is public and some of it is private. And the part that we're focusing on today is the public aspect of decision-making. And so it presents an interesting way for us as political scientists to tap into how justices are thinking. We get observational data in real time, and that's pretty neat. So we can observe how the justices interact with one another. We can observe how the justices interact with the attorneys, which is what we'll talk about in the next lecture. But the briefs are available to scholars. They're available to the public. Oral arguments, even though they're not televised, the transcripts are released. The audio is released from that. There's an audience for oral arguments, so there are news reporters in there. So we get much more of a real-time look into how justices are making decisions. Where the agenda setting stage we don't see, right? This happens behind the stage. We don't see until a case is either disposed of or granted, and so ultimately we'll see what cases land on the court's agenda, but we don't know what the votes are behind the scenes, which makes us reliant on archival data. The same thing for the opinion writing process, which happens behind closed doors. We don't get to see anything until the court releases an opinion. So this is the stage that we're going to focus on right now. Later this semester, we'll talk about opinion writing. But oral arguments are neat because it provides the first opportunity for Supreme Court justices to directly interact with the attorneys in the case. And there is so much that we can learn from this conversation. But before oral arguments take place, the parties submit the things that I've been referring to as merits briefs, which outlines their central legal argument. Before oral arguments, the justices and their law clerks parse through those briefs. And so I think it's maybe a little bit boring, but it's necessary to talk about this source of indirect interaction between the litigants and parties, that the parties submit these written briefs, and it's something that the justices use to prepare themselves for oral arguments. So specifically today, we're going to talk about a few big related questions. We're going to quickly unpack the process of merits briefs submission, and then we'll consider what litigant briefs actually are and what role they play in the judicial process. Then we'll turn our attention to how oral arguments play into the court's decision-making process. In particular, we'll consider whether the questions that justices ask during oral arguments hold any sort of predictive power and foreshadow the outcome in the case for us as scholars. So that's what we're trying to learn from oral arguments, is what is it that we as scholars, as social scientists, can get out of this very public aspect of the court's decision-making process. So let's begin our discussion with a quick overview of what merits briefs are. After a case clears the agenda-setting hurdle, the parties in the case must submit a merits brief, basically laying out the history of the case and creating a strong argument in favor of their most preferred outcome. These briefs are typically around 60 pages long, and while there is some variation, most briefs follow a pretty typical outline. First, the briefs identify what legal or constitutional questions they believe the court will answer in the case. Then they move into identifying the relevant parties to the case, and then it gets more interesting. At the outset, the parties present what's called a table of authorities, which is a simple list of precedent-setting cases that they'll use in their legal argument. The merits briefs then usually trace the case history in the lower courts and set up the basic legal argument. And then they go into a lot of detail about their legal position, appealing to the cases listed in the table of authorities to justify how they view the law at hand. Often the merits briefs also include information about the broader public policy implications of the case, expanding beyond just the resolution of the constitutional question. Finally, the briefs tie it all together in a conclusion. The justices and their clerks read these briefs before oral argument. Some justices have their clerks prepare something called a bench memo, which highlights and summarizes the information contained in the parties' briefs. Equipped with the information from the litigant briefs, then, oral argument provides an opportunity for justices to directly talk to the attorneys in the case. This wasn't always the practice, however. In the early days of the court, everything was done through oral argument. It wasn't until 1821 that the court began to require that the parties submit written briefs outlining their case arguments before oral argument. Notably, this is the only real public aspect of the court's decision-making process. Everything else, from the agenda-setting vote to the opinion-writing process, occurs internally and out of public view. So oral arguments provide an important look into the judicial process and gives us a glimpse of how Supreme Court justices think about the cases before them. The length of oral argument has changed throughout the court's history. Prior to 1849, there were no limits on how long the parties in the case could talk, and sometimes oral arguments spanned several days. But then, as the court's docket grew and the justices heard more and more cases each term, they began to impose time limits. In 1849, the court restricted each party to 2 hours. In other words, both the respondent and the petitioner had 2 hours to make their case before the Supreme Court during oral argument. Since 1970, each party, by default, receives 30 minutes to argue their case. However, this time limit isn't set in stone, and some cases, those which the court deems to be more important or legally complex, frequently receive more time. For example, when the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the healthcare case in 2012, the challenge to the Affordable Care Act, the Supreme Court allotted 6 whole hours for oral arguments spread across 3 different days. So, what can oral arguments tell us about Supreme Court decision making, and what role do they play in the federal judicial process? Well, they provide information to the justices in a variety of ways. Oral arguments give the justices an opportunity to glean more information about a case. For evidence of this, we need to look no further than to the questions the justices ask during oral arguments. Between 75 and 80% of the justices' questions are about issues that are not addressed in the litigants' merits briefs. Approximately 40% of the court's questions focus on policy considerations. Another 36% of the court's questions examine the role of external actors in the case. And the final 24% of the justices' questions focus on legal issues like precedent or the constitutionality of the statute and so forth. There is obviously a wealth of information generated during the hour allotted for oral arguments, as the justices are pushing the attorneys to address questions that many times were not fully fleshed out in the 60-page briefs that the parties submitted ahead of oral arguments. But oral arguments also give the justices a chance to learn about their colleagues' preferences. We can think of oral argument as a conversation between the justices on the court. They often, and admittedly, use the attorneys in the case as a vehicle to talk to one another. When he was Chief Justice, Justice Bill Rehnquist acknowledged this fact and said that smart attorneys will learn to use this conversation to their benefit. Oral argument really launches the Supreme Court's collegial decision-making process. Justice Kennedy has said that the justices have an unwritten rule or norm that prohibits them from discussing the cases with one another prior to oral argument, so to not form little cliques or cabals or groups that lobby one another before oral argument. Other justices, too, confirm this idea that the oral arguments are really a way for the justices to communicate with one another, to try to persuade one another of certain points, and that the attorney gets to reframe and deliver their messages, but it's much more of a way for justices to talk to each other than to talk to the attorney. So Chief Justice John Roberts said, when we get to the bench, it's really the first time we start to get some clues about what our colleagues think. So we often are using questions to bring out points that we think our colleagues ought to know about. Justice Ginsburg has said that oral argument questions are often directed more to a colleague than to the lawyer. It's a little unruly. Justice Kagan said, there is no doubt that part of what oral argument is about is a little bit of the justices talking to each other, with some helpless person standing at the podium who you're talking through. So we know that justices care a lot about oral arguments, that they're learning new information about the case, that they are using oral argument to gain information about colleagues' preferences, but oral arguments also matter for attorneys. Quite simply, political science research reveals that if you make good arguments, you're more likely to win. So in addition to crafting quality briefs on behalf of their party, attorneys have an incentive to invest in the oral argument process. And that's the part that we'll pick up on in the next lecture. But oral arguments are meaningful for scholars and court watchers too. They can inform political scientists about critical aspects of the court's decision-making process. For example, how heavily invested or involved the justices are in oral argument, as well as the types of questions they ask, can provide an indicator of case salience, of how important the case is. The process also tells us something about coalition formation as we study how the justices interact with one another and with the attorneys. A 2012 study by MSU's Ryan Black and Tim Johnson, who's at University of Minnesota, and Justin Wedeking, who's at University of Kentucky, examines this very process, this oral argument process, looking at how the justices signal one another and interrupt each other during the oral argument proceedings to learn more about the case and each other as they form the initial decision-making coalitions. Additionally, the justices' behavior during oral arguments allows scholars to predict case outcomes by revealing a great deal about the justices' preferences. This is the component of oral arguments where we are going to focus our attention now. To repeat, we're going to focus our attentions on the predictive power of oral arguments. Does the justices' behavior during oral argument foreshadow the outcome in a case? Early anecdotal evidence by scholars and news reporters alike suggested that the number of questions that the justices asked during oral arguments was meaningful. For example, before he became a member of the court, Chief Justice John Roberts actually conducted a small study where he found initial evidence that the party that fielded the most questions from the justices was more likely to lose than the party that received fewer questions from the justices. In particular, Chief Justice Roberts studied a small sample of cases, and he found that in 84% of those cases, the losing party was subjected to more questions from the Supreme Court bench. In recent years, as more data has become available, political scientists have sought to figure out whether oral arguments are truly indicative of the outcome in a case. In their 2009 study, the University of Minnesota political scientist Tim Johnson and a whole set of co-authors brought more data to bear on this question, seeking to determine if oral arguments can indeed be used to predict the outcome in a case. In a more recent study, the same group of scholars turned to examine the content and tone of the questions themselves to see if they could gain even more leverage about the predictive power of oral arguments. Before we get to the results of these studies, let's take a quick look at the descriptive data from oral argument proceedings from the last 30-40 years or so. What you should notice right away when we're looking at the graph before you is that the justices talk a lot. So we're going all the way back to 1979, and we're looking at the average number of questions per case. Remember that most cases, the justices, the attorneys are limited to a half an hour each. So oral argument typically is an hour long. So within an hour of arguments, the justices ask no fewer than 80 questions, and today typically speak between 120 and 140 times in every case. That's a lot, right? So it's pretty interesting when we're looking at this pattern that if we jump back to the early 80s, there's a lot of questions and then it dips down, and then suddenly there's this really sharp spike in the late 1980s moving into the 1990s, and then we've sort of flatlined, decreased a little bit, and then sort of flatlined since then. What's notable about this, why we see this sharp rise in questions, is that some soft-spoken justices were replaced by particularly loquacious ones. In particular, Justice Scalia joined the court in 1986. Justice Ginsburg joined the court in 1993. Justice Breyer joined the court in 1994. And all three of those justices have historically been very well known for their chattiness during oral arguments. Not only have the justices increased their overall questioning activity during oral arguments, but they've also increased the number of words that they use per argument, jumping from a low of just over 1,500 words in 1958 to more than 4,000 words per argument since 1996. The questions have increasingly become more detailed and more complex. For example, Justice Breyer is known for his rambling and sometimes bordering on ridiculous hypothetical questions. But in any case, think about how many words this is in a typical hour amount of time. That's what we're looking at on the y-axis here, the number of words per case. So the justices are talking more and more frequently than they did in the early 1980s. This graph shows the distribution of questions in yet another way. In the majority of cases, the justices speak a combined total of 110 to 130 times, which again is a lot considering the duration of arguments. It is quite clear that it's difficult for the parties' attorneys to get a word in edgewise. Indeed, the justices begin interrupting the attorneys from the outset, frequently posing their first question before the attorneys have even concluded their opening statements. So, if this graph is a little bit confusing, we're looking at the number of questions on the x-axis and the percent of cases that face that many questions on the y-axis. So we're looking at, less than 1% of cases has more than 400 questions. Just a couple percent of cases have around 50 questions. But then the concentration of cases falls somewhere between this 110 and 130 questions per case range. There is certainly variation in the number of times that each individual justice speaks during oral argument too. The graph on this slide will show you a box and whisker plot of how often justices speak during oral argument. It can look a bit confusing, so let's break it down slowly. On the x-axis, you'll see the justice's name, and on the y-axis, you'll see the number of questions that the justice asks. If we look at the gray box for Justice Kennedy, you'll see that he usually asks between 8 and 18 questions during an oral argument. At the median, Justice Kennedy asks about 15 questions in a case. The whiskers coming out of the box present the range for Kennedy, ranging from 0 questions in an oral argument to about 35. There are a few cases that are an outlier, so we've seen Kennedy ask as many as 58 questions in a 60-minute argument. You can certainly take the time to look at the oral argument behavior for each of the justices, but I want to quickly highlight a few other justices' engagements during oral argument. Clarence Thomas's silence during these proceedings is especially well known. Until just a few years ago, he hasn't uttered a single question during oral arguments for almost a decade. And even when Clarence Thomas has elected to participate, it has always been in a very limited fashion. In other words, when Thomas speaks, that's notable. On the other hand, Justices Breyer and Scalia rarely remain silent, often dominating the discourse during oral argument. Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Ginsburg, Stevens, and Souter fall somewhere in the middle, while Justices Kennedy, Alito, and Rehnquist typically interject fewer comments during oral arguments. These data are dated, but there are a few interesting patterns emerging on the current Roberts Court. Specifically, Justice Sotomayor is emerging as one of the most vocal, or the most vocal, of the justices on the court. In recent years, her participation rivaled Justice Scalia as being the most active justice during oral arguments, and she has certainly stepped up to fill the void that Scalia left behind when he died on the bench in 2016. All right, so what do the justices' questions have anything to do with figuring out what's happening in a case? In other words, can we predict case outcomes based on the questioning behavior of the justices? In their 2009 study, Professor Johnson and co-authors provide convincing empirical evidence that the number of questions directed at each side is meaningful. More specifically, the differential in questions can be used as an important indicator of which party will emerge the victor in a case. When the justices direct their attention more heavily to one party, posing more questions to that side during oral arguments, that party is more likely to lose its case. In the graph shown here, the x-axis contains the differential in questions between the petitioner and the respondent. It ranges from negative 45 to positive 45. This means that on the left side, the respondent was asked 45 more questions than the petitioner. Alternately, the petitioner was asked 45 fewer questions than the respondent. In such an extreme hypothetical case, this imbalance almost certainly indicates that the petitioner will emerge victorious. You can see that by examining the y-axis, which shows the probability that the petitioner wins. Conversely, at the other extreme, if the justices pelt the petitioner with more questions, directing 45 more at that side than to the respondent, the likelihood that the petitioner prevails is very, very slim. In general, for each 10-question increase in the questioning differential between the parties, the likelihood of winning decreases by roughly 15%. And that's a really neat finding, namely that the number of questions foreshadows the outcome in a case. So, just one quick point. If you're paying really close attention to this graph, which you should be spending some time doing, if there's a 0-question differential, right, so that means that both the petitioner and the respondent receive exactly the same number of questions from the justices. Look at where the probability is that the petitioner wins. It's above 50%, right? It's actually closer to 60%. And that's notable because that is what we see, indeed, in fact, that the petitioner is more likely to win, that this baseline probability usually edges towards the petitioner. And that makes sense when we think about the logic of appealing the case before the Supreme Court. That if you are a smart attorney bringing a case before the Supreme Court, most of the time you care about the likelihood of winning. If you don't think you're going to win on the merits before the Supreme Court, you might have a disincentive to appeal the case. So it makes sense that the petitioner is more likely to win than the respondent by just this sort of slight edge. So that's why we see this baseline probability above 50% here. But the question differential, this for each 10-question increase in the differential between the parties, the likelihood of winning decreases by 15%. So that means that if the petitioner is asked 10 questions more than the respondent, it decreases the probability of winning from 60% to 45%. Conversely, if the respondent is asked 10 questions more than the petitioner, it increases the probability that the petitioner wins from 60% to about 75%. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, use the discussion forum and I'm happy to clarify further. So this whole idea of examining just like counting it up, right? This is something that we can all do. The transcripts are released. We can go through and just make these predictions. And we can also assign a probability to our predictions. We are 75% confident that a petitioner is going to win or that the respondent is going to win. And that's a pretty cool thing that we can do. The media runs with that a lot, so we'll see those kinds of predictions made. Pay attention if you ever hear a news report after oral arguments that they'll talk about the number of questions. But that's not the end of the story. If we push it further and think not just about the sheer number of questions, but about what types of questions the justices are asking, then maybe that sends an even clearer study. And that's what the same group of scholars that we've been talking about who study oral arguments, Ryan Black, Sarah Truhl, Tim Johnson, Jerry Goldman, they extended this study in 2011 to consider the content or the emotion behind the questions that the justices posed during oral arguments. Those authors recognized that it might be valuable to have an overall prediction of case outcomes based on the aggregate question and behavior of the justices, but what we're really more interested in is what the questions say about the justices themselves or about the court as a whole. Research in social psychology finds that individuals use emotions with greater frequency when they care about a particular outcome in a decision-making process. So the authors in this study extend that theory from social psychology to the justices on the Supreme Court, suggesting that the tone of a justice's questions reveals his or her preferences and is therefore indicative of her vote in that case. So to code the emotion that undergirds the questions posed during oral arguments, the authors employ something called the Dictionary of Affect in Language, which scores words in a two-dimensional space based on the pleasantness and activation of the words. And so that's what you see on your screen here. That's what this graph is. Of particular interest for our purposes is the difference between pleasant and unpleasant words. Very unpleasant words are those like chaos, failed, hostile, nightmare, phony. while very pleasant words are those like award, confidence, favorable, quality, respect. By using this approach to score the individual words, the scholars are then able to analyze the content of the justice's questions and statements during oral argument. Specifically, they again just count. They tally the total number of very pleasant and very unpleasant words directed at each party in the case. They then divide that number by the total number of words directed to the party to generate a proportion of pleasant and unpleasant words from the bench as a whole. Professor Black and his co-authors hypothesize that as the court directs more hostile or unpleasant language toward a particular side's attorney, the court is less likely to rule in favor of that side. Conversely, as the court directs more pleasant words toward a particular side, the court is more likely to support that side when it votes on the merits. And indeed, this is exactly what the authors find. As the proportion of very pleasant words directed to the petitioner increases, relative to the total number of words spoken, the likelihood that the petitioner wins the case increases pretty modestly. So this is not as pronounced, right? We're looking at the percent of more pleasant words directed towards the petitioner and the probability that the petitioner wins. And this is a much more modest increase, that a 1% increase in the number of very pleasant words results in a 2% increase in the probability that the petitioner wins. Still, it means something, right? It's not as pronounced of a magnitude as counting the differential in questions. But, on the other hand, the number of unpleasant words statistically significantly reduces the chance that a given party will win the case. In their published work, the authors report that when the court's unpleasantness is balanced, meaning that the petitioner and the respondent are recipients of the same proportion of unpleasant words, so we're right here, right? The likelihood that the petitioner wins the case is about 60%. Which again is roughly equivalent to the court's typical rate of reversal. But when the court as a whole directs significantly more unpleasant language to the respondent, the likelihood that the petitioner wins the case jumps to 75%. On the other hand, if the petitioner feels the heat of a greater proportion of unpleasant words, the likelihood that the petitioner's party prevails drops to only 48%. So, let's quickly tie this all together. This is going to be a key slide for you as you are reviewing because it's highlighting what I expect you to know. So you ought to know this differential. On the next exam, I will ask you to make a prediction, and in one of the things at your disposal to make a prediction is the number of questions asked at oral argument. And so you ought to know what the baseline prediction is that the petitioner wins, and then pay attention to the differential in questions and think about how that changes the probability of how justices vote on a case. So for each 10-question increase in the questioning differential between the parties, the likelihood of winning decreases by 15%. The tone of justices' questions matters too. I don't expect you to know the exact probabilities here, but you should know that the happier the tone, the more likely that side is to prevail on the merits. The more hostile the court's tone, if they're more negative to one side than the other, then the likelihood that that party, the one that is the recipient of that negative language, the likelihood that that person or that party wins decreases. So again, spend some time working through how oral arguments actually works. Pay attention to how much time is allotted to each side. Think about the typical structure of a merits brief. And then be able to apply this basic method of counting the number of questions at oral argument to make a prediction, a probabilistic prediction. Okay, so if I ask you to make a prediction, if I give you oral argument data and I say make a prediction about who's going to win, don't just say I predict the petitioner is going to win. Make a specific prediction. How sure are you that the petitioner is going to win? And tell me why. If you can do that, then once again, you are in great shape. Thank you so much for your attention today. Look forward to talking to you about attorneys in our next lecture.